Dear students, in the last modules we have studied about crime, theories of crime, modus operandi, mens rea and various things about crime. After studying this module, you shall be able to know what is domestic crime, what are the types of domestic crimes, what is the nature of domestic crime in India, what are effects of domestic violence and what are the causes of domestic crime. We will start with the introduction to domestic crime. The power of dominance and control above other individual leads to domestic violence. It is not a matter of anger. It is very infrequently seen that assailant act aggressively with friends, colleague or a boss. Abusers can act delightful, loving and focused when they need to. Factors such as drinking, drugs, genetics, the victim's behavior or stress does not stimulate assailant to do domestic violence. It is learned behavior. In altogether races, religions and socio-economic groups, domestic violence used to take place. Domestic violence is defined in the law as crime that has been committed among persons of opposite sex who live mutually in the similar domestic or who has survived mutually in the past, or those who have a common child or are expecting a child irrespective of whether having same residence place or not, or in the following relations: spouse, youth, ancestor, earlier spouse, brother, grandchild, parent, sister. Operational definitions of domestic violence. It is a form of manners in which one partner make an effort to sustain another over the other through physical force, intimidation and threats. Domestic violence takes place when an individual utilizes physical violent behavior, compulsion, terrorization, threats, isolation, stalking, emotional abuse, sexual abuse or economic abuse to control another partner in an association. Domestic violence can be a solo act or an array of behavior in relationships that takes in relationships like dating, marriage, family and live-in. Other definitions: survivor or victim, the person who is targeted for abuse; abuser or assailant, the person who is inflicting the abuse; any incident of threatened, cruel conducts or violence, mental, physical, sexual, economic or emotional among adults who are or were friendly partners or family members irrespective of sex or sexuality. The criminal acts specifically well defined in the law are assault, criminal damage, custodial interference, endangerment, imprisonment, intimidation, kidnapping, trespass, disorderly conduct by fighting, unreasonable noise, abuse language or reckless demonstrate or liberation of a deadly weapon or risky instrument. Now we will talk about types of domestic crimes. Domestic violence is of 5 types. The purpose of all types of abuse is to gain power and control over the victim. The intention of every forms of abuse is same, but is often inflicted upon a victim in various combinations. Physical exploitation is the practice of physical force by one individual against other individual that results in hurting the individual or person remains in the risk of getting injured. Example: pushing, grabbing, slapping, kicking, hitting with an object, use of knife or pistol, acid throwing, burning. Next is emotional abuse. Emotional abuse can be verbal or non-verbal. Threatening to gain obedience or fulfillment, destructing or threats to destruct the victim's private property and possessions, violent behavior against an object such as a wall or piece of furniture or pet in the presence of the intended victim which acts as a way of instilling terror in advance for future purpose. Shouting or blaring, name repetition, continuous annoyance, discomforting, bullying or scornful the victim, either single-handedly, inside the home, in open or in face of family or friends. Appraising or disapprove the victim's happenings or aims, not believing the victim's judgment, making victim to feel like if he is useless without the abuser's presence, over-possessive nature towards victim and isolating him from friends and family, over-suspicious regarding the victim's whereabouts, under the impact of medications or alcohol, saying hurtful things or being in state of drunkenness, act as an excuse to say the hurtful things, blaming the victim for abuser's present financial or emotional situation. Financial abuse. It may include custody of resources, forcefully taking away from the victim, or victim's name is used to acquire debt. Economic or financial abuse consists of custody of financial capitals like money or credit cards, stealing from or deceive a partner for money or belongings, exploiting the close partner's assets for own profit, taking of the physical resources like foodstuff, dresses, obligatory medicines or accommodation from a partner, not permitting the partner or close companion to work or choose an occupation. Next is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is mostly associated to physical abuse. It may occur either with, before or after physical abuse. Sexual abuse includes sexual assault, indulging someone in undesirable, unsecure or humiliating sexual motion by force, sexual harassment, mock someone to attempt to draw a line on their sexual or reproductive selections, sexual exploitation by forcing somebody to see pornography or making someone to engage in pornography movie making by using force. Next is spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is anything that comes in the way of you doing something or feeling good about yourself. Spiritual abuse includes by means of the partner's or close companions' religious or mystical theories to influence them, saving the spouse from involving their religious or spiritual beliefs, teasing the another individual's religious or spiritual beliefs, constraining the offspring to be nurtured in a faith that the companion has not agreed to. Next, we will talk about the nature of domestic crimes in India. Domestic violence is a wide-ranging theory integrating many systems of physical violence, sexual violence and a variety of forcible, intimidating and controlling behaviors. It is damaging bodily, mentally and publicly. Domestic violence can happen in any close or familiar connection, unrelated of whether the partners are living with each other or not, whether they are matrimonial or cohabiting or living in 3 generational extended families. It is this interpersonal component rather than place that defines the violence as domestic. Since while it usually happens in the home, it can fall out into the streets, bus stops, bars or even result in road traffic accidents. It is the reality that the committer and the victim are not only well acknowledged to each other but remain in friendly or familial relationships that makes it particularly difficult to manage with by the survivor or victim, backing and criminal justice agencies and in law. Domestic violence as hate crime. The operations of the strategies of power and violent control described above has parallels with the ways in which those with power have the ability to commit other hatred crimes against less powerful groups. For example, racist and homophobic violence. In hate crimes, Those with power exploit cultural stereotypes to deny, minimize, excuse or justify their use of viciousness against weak members of minority groups. Domestic violence as a gendered crime. The gendered nature of crime, and particularly violent crime and sexual offences, the gendered nature of domestic violence should not be surprising. This gendered patterning, the operational reality for police, health authorities and support agencies, does not mean that men are never its victims. Domestic violence against females also consists in enlisting ladies in fear of forthcoming grave bodily harm by terror of force. This includes fear of viciousness or any other conduct that would cause significant emotional suffering. The nature and degree of such emotional violence was studied by the research team. The defendants informed that they were insulted repeatedly in the presence of their children and relatives, 28%, were blamed for everything that went wrong in the family, 27%, given threats of divorce, 12%, given treatment like a servant, 19%, subjected to strict watch on their movement, 15%, frequently charged for small and negligible matters, 27%, compelled to feel shamefaced for no faults, 20%, prohibited to meet parents, friends and relatives, 12%, had no freedom to express views on family matters, 12%, harassed by badly criticizing family background, 17%, criticized for lack of or less intelligence repeatedly, 13%, were given threats of suicide by husband, 11%, and were given verbal threats to practice physical force, 13%, subjected to negligence of health, 17%, suspected for extramarital relations, 11%, insulting and ugly language was used for them, 14%, repeatedly blamed for improper housekeeping, 17%. Economic abuse is yet another form of domestic violence against females. It is the result of dependency, objective, subjective or both. The chief forms of financial abuse are averting a woman from captivating a job, forcing her to leave the existing job, collecting full amount of her salary under force, pressurizing her for bringing money from her parents, family again and again, and prohibiting her from making purchases of her choice. The causes of domestic violence as reported by the women respondents were parents' failure to pay full amount of dowry, 11%, refusal to bring money from patriarchal family, 13%, parents' failure to keep promises and fulfill commitments made at the time of marriage, 8%, premarital love affairs suspected, 9%, extramarital relations, 10%, resistance to sexual abuse, 4%, medically unfit for conception, 7%, female child is delivered every time, 7%, husband's unemployment, 13%, husband had problems at workplace, 19%, and husband's alcoholism, 25%. Sex in Indian society is a matter of personal life and as such not to be discussed openly. It was therefore very problematic for the investigating team to collect information about the impact of domestic violence on the sex life of the victims. However, the required information was collected through indirect questions. The together data discovers that the sex life of women was affected in one form or the other as a result of domestic violence meted to them. The incidence and extent of domestic violence is at higher rate in nuclear families as compared to joint families. There is no significant difference in percentage of victims of domestic violence between families belonging to different religious groups. The size of family has no relative with the incidence or extent of domestic violence. Thus, no association is established in the incidence and extent of domestic in the families and their religious background. Now, what are the different effects of domestic crime? Anxiety, chronic depression, chronic pain, death, dehydration, dissociative states, drug and alcohol dependence, eating disorders, emotional overreactions to stimuli, general emotional numbing, health problems, malnutrition, panic attacks, poor adherence to medical recommendations, repeated self-injury, self-neglect, sexual dysfunction, sleep disorder, somatization disorders, strained family relationships, suicide attempts, inability to adequately respond to the needs of their children. Now, the summary of domestic crime. The effects of domestic violence on human society are immense and almost impossible to measure by a single yardstick. The cumulative effect of the menace of domestic violence affects every area of life, and its conclusion is visible to the sensitive eye, at home and in the office, in markets and restaurants, in schools and corporates. The barterer and the bartered are both conspicuous in the teeming faces of millions on the street of every country, in bleak faces with broken spirits. Domestic violence also takes a huge toll on a nation in terms of its various resources. In addition to the human, the economic damage of domestic violence is truly enormous, but a broken life cannot be measured with a rupee. However, victims of domestic abuse do incur huge medical bills and lose their capacity to be commercially productive. Victims of domestic violence usually suffer psychological damage also and need continuous mental care to function normally. Family being the microcosm of society, the effect of domestic violence infects the forthcoming generations and violates all the people living with the perpetrators and victims of violence. It will not be an exaggeration to state that domestic violence has a rippling effect on society, causing whole generations and communities to become sick. Moreover, domestic violence is hugely damaging to the state in terms of time and money spent by health workers, law enforcers, lawyers, courts and social activists. Social welfare organizations are now being built with fully functional staff and shelter facilities for the victims of domestic world over. These cost a lot in monetary terms with their entourage of counselors, other services and hotlines. Many surveys from time to time have revealed that domestic violence translates into absenteeism from work, decreased productivity, retraining of works and sometimes retrenchment for the employed. Needless to say that this has reduced the GDP of nations considerably, forcing the world to function below its potential. It has also been decided that domestic violence has a very bad outcome on children and disrupts the development of the future generation. Education organizations are now identifying this element and giving dedicated amenities to children who undergo from behavior and consideration difficulties originating from domestic violence. Children developing in families which are diseased with the condition of domestic violence need clinical caution for depression, terror, distress, nervousness, pressure and shock related mental problems. These problems also metamorphose as physical ailments in many cases. Such offspring grow up to be less productive and cost the state money for their poor abilities. Persons who are fetched up with the terrible effects of domestic violence are not optimistic, can take lesser risks and usually continue the cycle of violence in their mature life by either being committers or keen victims of exploitation. In the end, domestic violence cannot ever be removed from the social order except civilization refuses to abide it. This will need an interior alteration in the elementary nature of society world over. Commencement with the acknowledgement of the value of every human being as an individual. If the law does not buck up in the terms of implementing punishment on those who violate others within the sacred walls of the institution called family and home, the fibbler will remain to be dishonored and ill-treated by the stronger, either physically, mentally, materially, and spiritually.